знаешь, мне совсем не интересно. Слава богу, ты не он, а ты она. Еби меня по-китайски, соси мыку по-турецки. Как будто я самый первый, как будто я твой надменный. За все, что было так мало, и мне тебя не хватало. Еби меня по-грузински, хочу, чтоб вечно состала. Отсоси на выдох, отсоси на вдох. Твои половые губы шепчут об одном. Прислонись, одну залупы, ох, и ты сделаешь захват, потом наоборот. Убежать хотел я и все потерять, и на финише поможет мне Господь Бог. Снова научить меня ебаться может, сможешь ты, если он не смог. Еби меня по-китайски, соси мыку по-турецки. Как будто я самый первый, как будто я твой надменный. За все, что было так мало, и мне тебя не хватало. Еби меня по-грузински, хочу, чтоб вечно состала. Еби меня по-китайски, соси мыку по-турецки. Как будто я самый первый, как будто я твой надменный. За все, что было так мало, и мне тебя не хватало. Еби меня по-грузински. Еби меня по-китайски, китайски, китайски. За все, что было так мало, и мне тебя не хватало. Еби меня по-грузински, хочу, чтоб вечно состала. Бесконечно я дрочил, не помню где, в городе чужом, прям на улице. Хорошо, никто не слышал моих песен и не видел никогда моего лица. Бесконечно я дрочил, не помню где, в городе чужом, прям на улице. Хорошо, никто не слышал моих песен и не видел никогда моего лица. Я хочу забыть, как мне было чудесно, не могу хоть рот бери, кругом голова. Только знаешь, мне совсем не интересно, слава богу, ты не он, а ты она. Еби меня по-китайски, соси мыку по-турецки. Как будто я самый первый, как будто я твой надменный. За все, что было так мало, и мне тебя не хватало. Еби меня по-грузински, хочу, чтоб вечно состала. Отсоси на выдох, отсоси на вдох. Твои половые губы шепчут об одном. Прислонись, одну залупы, ох, и ты сделаешь захват, потом наоборот. Убежать хотел я и все потерять, и на финише поможет мне Господь Бог. Снова научить меня ебаться может, сможешь ты, если он не смог. Еби меня по-китайски, соси мыку по-турецки. Как будто я самый первый, как будто я твой надменный. За все, что было так мало, и мне тебя не хватало. Еби меня по-грузински, хочу, чтоб вечно состала. Бесконечно я дрочил, не помню где, в городе чужом, прям на улице. Хорошо, никто не слышал моих песен и не видел никогда моего лица. Я хочу забыть, как не было чудесно, не могу хоть рот бери, кругом голова. Только знаешь, мне совсем не интересно, слава богу, ты не он, а ты она. Еби меня по-китайски, соси мой хуй по-турецки, как будто я самый первый, как будто я твой надменный. За все, что было так мало, и мне тебя не хватало. Еби меня по-грузински, хочу, чтоб вечно там стало. Отсоси на выдох, отсоси на вдох, мои половые губы шепчут об одном. Прислонись одну залупочкой, ох, и ты сделаешь захват, потом наоборот. Убежать хотел я и все потерять, и на финише поможет мне Господь Бог. Снова научить меня ебаться может, сможешь ты, если он не смог. Еби меня по-китайски, убежать хотел.
Hello. Hello. Can people hear me? It's a seamless transition. Has the audio worked as always? As someone could just give me a quick shout out. And if it works this time, everything is A-okay, then I think we will never have to do an audio check going forward. So someone in chat can just give me a quick shout out that the music played and that you can hear me now. Counselor Peter Cawthorne, hello. Hello. Yes, we are here. Yes. So everything worked. I think going forward is I'll not have to give an audio check going forward. So I think that's you sound great, mate. Thank you. Awesome. How is everyone doing? Is everyone doing well? Everyone happy? Everyone jolly? Everyone looking forward to another week to come of death, destruction, and horrors beyond our imagining. So, yes, let's work. Get off that. So, what this is, I'm hoping this isn't going to be too long a stream. This is a wrap up rather than a proper full stream. For people, I'm sure, who are autistically invested in this stuff as much as I am, you will all be presently aware that we are expecting a great Russian offensive in the days, if not weeks to come. Some say it's already started. Russian offensive action is certainly picked up in certain areas, but I think the big grand slam, for lack of a better term, is yet to come. And that seems to be imminent, present. So we're just waiting for that. So before that happens, because that's going to be a whole lot of fun, probably going to be a very busy couple of days whenever that starts. I just want to wrap up some things that's happened, discuss some issues, developments that's happened in Ukraine and elsewhere, before we get bogged down into the horror show that is going to come. So, I've been lazy and I haven't taken notes this time, so I'm going to have to wing it off the top of my head. But where should we start? He's on the screen, so I think we'll start there. So, interesting development today from Belarus. Here's our beloved Batska on screen in a very wide way. I don't know why my screen stretched that picture so much, but here's based Batska, Lukashenko, the American hand offering money, and he says no. And I don't read Cyrillic enough to read the rest of that, but he says bugger off. So no globalist American dollary dues in Minsk. Thank you very much. Though if you do have globalist dollary dues, feel free to throw them at me at Super Chats or into my PayPal. I'll always accept those. but I'm not going to promote stuff that you'll expect me to do with those globalist dollary dues. But either way, so where is it? There's a little interesting development that's emerged today. That's well, I guess yesterday, the past couple of days, which I just kind of want to touch on. Sort of a quick running history lesson here. Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia obviously were the core of the former Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapses, they become independent states. I'm sort of giving a very quick history lesson just to sort of explain the point I'm going to come to. The Belovezh Accords dissolves the USSR. Lukashenko here does not immediately become president of Belarus. There's a sort of transition period between Soviet Belarus to the Lukashenko period. I think it's around about 2 to 3 years. Lukashenko comes to power in 1994 and quickly solidifies power and removes all opposition, ethically or not. Lukashenko never really, in these early days, he was very ambitious man. He looked to restore the Soviet Union. Soviet Union might be too strong of a word. He was looking to restore the Union, maybe not communism itself. And Lukashenko sort of viewed Belarus, this is a bit of conjecture, but it's kind of panned out the way things happened. Lukashenko was looking to actually run for president of Russia, potentially in 1990. This is the late 90s. Yeltsin is incredibly unpopular. Various financial crises in Russia. Democracy was failing in Russia. Lukashenko was running Belarus in a fairly stable system, if people can remember back to previous streams where I spoke about Belarus in general. Belarus managed to escape the rampant corruption of the 1990s and to a degree the 2000s that Ukraine and Russia suffered. So Lukashenko was kind of viewed politically at that time as sort of a stable hand. He kept out the chaos of the post-Soviet collapse, and he is alleged to have looked to have floated the idea of running for president of Russia while also being president of Belarus, which is an interesting concept in of itself, with the idea of the unification of Russia and Belarus into a single state, and then potentially to go on to unify peacefully Ukraine as well into this new sort of revived union state. Obviously that didn't happen. Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin became president after Yeltsin resigned on Christmas Day, or was it New Year's Day? Well, he resigned at the end of 1990. That kind of pushed Lukashenko back, and Lukashenko kind of resigned himself to a degree of administering Belarus. Alongside this, in the mid-90s, you had the formation of a intergovernment transnational institution called the Union State, which is the subject of today's discussion. Well, not today's discussion, but on the point I'm coming to. So after the USSR collapsed, you had the Commonwealth of Independent States, which was an extremely loose body that is largely irrelevant. It was more prescient during the very early 90s whenever it maintained the unified Soviet command, and former Soviet Olympians participated under the CIS. But nonetheless, for all intents and purposes, the CIS effectively is largely irrelevant. It's kind of what the Commonwealth is to the British today. But between Belarus and Russia, this was kind of instituted at Lukashenko's inception as part of his grand plan to potentially annex Russia, to take over Russia, to unify Belarus and Russia. They formed another organization called the Union State. The Union State is kind of to be viewed sort of like what the European Union is, in a very ham-fisted way. The idea was ever closer union as such, with the idea of the eventual unification of the two, preferably the free Slavic sister East Slavic states. So this gets set up in 1996, I believe, and there's various treaties regarding not the abolition, well, the visa conditions for Belarusians and Russians to travel between each country is effectively largely removed. Trade is regularized, and there's other economic links and unions that are kind of put together and tied in. And the idea was that both countries would slowly integrate with each other with the idea of eventual unification between each other into a new country, which is to be called the Union State. The idea wasn't that Belarus would then become a part of Russia, it's that Russia and Belarus would form an entirely new country, sort of like what the Soviet Union was, but not, because the Soviet Union, whenever you say that, people sort of think inherently Soviet communism is a part of it. For the intents of this discussion, whenever I refer to the Soviet Union, I'm just talking about the political union between the member states, not the ideological communist union. That's what I'm talking about here, because the Union State is not going to be, and was never intended to be, a communist state, although it has a lot of nostalgia and iconography of the old communist and Soviet Union. So, the 2000s come along. Lukashenko is happy plugging along in Belarus. Putin starts to stabilize Russia. The Russian economy starts to pick up. Russia starts to flex its might a bit abroad, especially in what the Russians call the near abroad. The near abroad, for people who are not aware, is a geopolitical term used in Russia, especially Russian politics, to refer to territories that used to be part of the Soviet Union. So the Russians feel that they have a specific interest in these states, and that's where the term the near abroad comes from. Part of certain parts, as we can see in Ukraine, is probably the ultimate expression of this. Certain states in the near abroad chafe under this. They don't like the idea of the Russians flexing influence back upon them. Belarus is not an exception to this. Whenever Russian gas starts to go through Belarus onto Europe, but also the Belarusians themselves buy gas from the Russians, so did the Ukrainians in this time. The Belarusians and the Ukrainians, this is all disputed and stuff, but the very base understanding of it is the Ukrainians and the Belarusians are alleged to have effectively stolen gas or not paid the bills for the gas that they would get from the Russians. The Russians would turn off the gas. This would revolve into various like petty squabbles and trade wars between the states. I believe milk, there was a big dispute between the importation and exportation of milk and milk products between Belarus and Russia in the 2000s up until more recently. Similar stuff happened with Ukraine. As Russian economic power grows and Putin stabilizes Russia further through the 2000s, this influence increases upon these states. Lukashenko sort of resigned himself to never really going to be able to take over Russia as such, or set the terms of this relationship on his own basis. This is where you sort of get the strange dynamic of Belarus, where Belarus is sort of, it is a very Russophone state, a Russophile state. Lukashenko sort of removes the Belarusian language, or downgrades it from an official language and institutes Russian as the official state language. He brings back all the old Soviet nostalgia and iconography into the state. This is why Belarus still has a KGB. This is why Belarus maintains, without the hammer and sickle, the old Soviet flag for Belarus. Lukashenko is very much sort of like this. I think he's more of a Soviet nationalist than he is a Russian nationalist. And it's a very nuanced way to sort of differentiate the two. But he sort of used Belarus as kind of like this frontier state holding back the fringes of NATO expansion upon the old Russian Soviet world, the Ruski Sovietsky Mir. But at the same time, while he might be very anti-Western at times, he is not or at least whenever he could, he was not resigned to simply being a puppet of Moscow and of Putin. So this is where you sort of get this strange dynamic where Belarus would flirt with the West through the 2000s and the 2010s. Then they would go back to seeking closer ties with the Russians in Moscow, and it's sort of like this strange trying to play both sides off with each other into a middle ground, while Lukashenko just looks to sort of solidify Belarus as its own kind of quasi-independent power. But this changed in 2020. I'm sure many people who follow this stuff will remember there was an attempted color revolution in 2020, the disputed 2020 presidential elections. I'm not an expert in this field, so I'm not going to say who won legitimately or not, but nonetheless, Lukashenko remains in power through disputed means. The West refused to recognize him as legitimate president of Belarus anymore. A large protest movement rises up in Belarus, and there's weeks of very violent protests in Minsk and across the country, which are brutally put down by the domestic Belarusian security services. But actually, there's a bit I should have come to before this, but I'll plow on with this before I touch it. There was a point where it looked very shaky, where Lukashenko might have actually been overturned and turfed out of power. But then it is strongly alleged that the Russians, and particularly Vladimir Putin, came in and said, we will support you. We will ensure the stability of your state, of your regime. But you will effectively become a client of Moscow now. So with this support from Russia, the protests were very rapidly quashed. Belarus was stabilized, and Lukashenko found himself, whereas before he managed to maintain a certain element of independence, he now found himself effectively, he knew where his bread was buttered, that he only remained in power at the acquiescence of his benefactors in Moscow. So that's kind of how we are now. This is the situation where Belarus has been in since, and how it's acted throughout the war. So now we come on to the war. Pardon me. So what happens now? Well, how this relates to what's happening in Ukraine. In 2014, to sort of illustrate this sort of duo dynamism in Belarusian rhetoric, the Euromaidan happens, the coup, the revolution, however you want to phrase it, happens in Kiev. Yanukovych is turfed out of power. The new revolutionary government comes into power. The Russians go into Crimea and reclaim it, annex it. The Donbass rises up in revolt, and the war in the Donbass starts. Lukashenko at the time, a far sight from what he's saying today, Lukashenko actually condemned the Russian annexation of Crimea, and he was very against Russian intentions in the Donbass and supporting and propagating the war there. This is why the Minsk talks, hence why they're called Minsk, happened in Minsk, because Belarus, Lukashenko was sort of seen as a fairly neutral arbiter. This is a guy who normally is meant to be very pro-Russian, but yet he was very condemnatory of Moscow's actions during 2014 and 2015. So the talks happen in Minsk. That's where the Minsk agreements come from. So that happens then. This is to feed into why this happens. Well, Lukashenko at the time, of course, as I previously mentioned, is that the relations with Russia go up and down, various trade wars and stuff. And Lukashenko looked at what happened in Ukraine. And naturally, as many other countries surrounding Russia also sort of feared this could happen to them if they really piss off the Russians. So Lukashenko was sort of trying to hedge his bets as such, as trying to curry favor with Western interests, potentially guarantee the independence and sovereignty of Belarus against any potential Russian expansionism in that area, but also to try and curry favor with Moscow to remain a reliable partner to Moscow, so that Moscow may never feel the need to act in Belarus as they felt they were compelled to act in Ukraine as such. So that's a bit of the background to this. So then the war happens, 2021. The Russian military starts to set up strongly in Belarus, and Minsk, Lukashenko, and Belarus has been strongly in favor or supportive of the Russian war, with caveats. Of course, everyone remembers the push on Kyiv and in Chernihiv, then the north of Ukraine that came from Belarus. The Belarusians have been extremely providing logistics and other support to the Russians, and namely as a base to fire missiles into Ukraine. So the independence of Belarus is certainly it is whittling away as such, as Russian military assets build up in Belarus. And as Russian influence in Belarus increases, the sovereignty of Belarus, I would argue, is rapidly diminishing. And I think Lukashenko realizes this, but it's kind of a position he was forced into, rightly or wrongly. And I think he's now sort of he sees where the wind is blowing. He knows if Belarus is it is where it is, Belarus will never be able to resume, at least under him, or the regime that he propagates whenever he stands down, if his son takes over or another person from his bloc as such ever becomes head of Belarus. Belarus, as it's currently constituted, will never resume regular relations with the West. There is only one direction for Belarus to now look: diplomatically, economically, militarily, to guarantee its independence and its prosperity, and that is to the east, that is towards Russia. In the same way that Russia is going closer to China because the entire West is now closed off to Russia, Belarus is on a smaller level looking towards Russia as its future, because it's the only road open to them at this stage. So I think that's what Lukashenko recognizes, and now he's trying to prepare the ground for the best deals that he can get for himself and for Belarus out of where the wind is blowing as such. This all depends on the outcome of the war. Like, for example, if the Russians completely lose the war and Russia collapses, yada, 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 obviously this is, not a feasible thing. But I think the way the winds are blowing, I think Russia will gain something from the war. I don't think it's looking for a total defeat, but it's not looking at a total victory. And as a result of that is the fate of Belarus as well, is kind of sealed through this. So with that sort of meandering spiel, I'll just go into the post that I was looking to discuss, as there's an interesting post that came out in Telegram, which I will show here. How big is that on screen? No. Can I add a little display capture image? Window capture. Does this work? Yes, there we go. So, I'm trying something new here, chat. Is this going to work? Yes. So, just bringing this up on screen because I seen this, pardon me, posted in, which I've shared into the channel, which is an interesting post, which kind of has led me down this speculatory autistic spiel. So, this post from AZ Geopolitics. Lukashenko considers unification with Russia as the best option for Europe. I'll just annotate this post for the people who for whatever bizarre reason like my accent, and doesn't actually sit down and watch this stuff and just puts it on the background. The Belarusian leader noted that that quote, Americans and Chinese would envy this alliance, end quote. President of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, considers unification with Russia the best option for Europe. He said this on Thursday at a meeting with representatives of the foreign and national media. For people who are not aware, Lukashenko gave a large press conference. Large might be a bit too strong of a word, but he had a press conference the other day, yesterday, where he had members of Russian, Belarusian, and also Western media was there. The BBC was interesting there in attendance, and they were all asking him a bunch of questions and such. So I'm assuming this is where these comments came from. The best option for Europeans is to unite with Russia. Am I reading that right? No, I'm not too sure if that's written right, but I'm assuming he's obviously talking there. The best option for Europe would be if Belarus was to unite with Russia, not Europe to unite with Russia. Here are resources, there are high technologies, and it would be the main pole of the planet. The Bell TA, which I believe is a Belarusian news agency, quotes him and saying, according to the Belarusian president, quote, Americans and Chinese would envy this alliance, end quote, quote, and there would be three powerful points on which this planet would be held. The USA, China, and the European continent together with Russia. Consider it Eurasian. Oh no, so okay. I read a different post, and this is a different one. So he's actually consider Europe. Okay, so perhaps the fourth pole would be around India, worthy for the planet. Earlier, Lukashenko stated that the world that was on a planetary scale will not exist today or tomorrow, as the new global players wanted multiplayer. Okay, forgive me, my entire spiel's kind of been offset this because this isn't the post I was looking at. This is a different post, but according to this post, Alexander Lukashenko is now a base Duganist. Europe needs to unite with Russia, and the Eurasian Union needs to exist. So Duganism with Eurasianism with Belarusian characteristics, going by this post. There was another post where I read where it said that he was considering the unification of Belarus with Russia, which is a lot more feasible in my mind, to be honest, and is something that's been on the cards for a long time. So this, to me, is kind of thrown me off for a bit of a loop. Sorry, chat. I should probably have actually put some prep into this than wing it. So Belarus wants Lukashenko wants Europe to unite with Russia. Okay. Radio. I'll carry on with my actual spiel of what I was thinking about talking about, because this is different to what I was saying, which is this flag, and this flag is what I wanted to going down the line of what I was looking to discuss. The Union State. Going back to what I was saying about the Union State, the Union State is kind of like what the reformed USSR would have been had Gorbachev's reforms in the late 80s and early 90s came to fruition, at least on a very smaller scale. So whenever communism was sort of on its way out in the USSR, Gorbachev was looking to the socialist system could not be retained, but he was looking to try and retain the union, the political union of the various republics. The Baltics were already gone by this stage, but there was strong indication that the rest of the union could have been maintained. And this is one of the few actual free and fair elections that were ever held in the Soviet Union. I believe it was the first of only two, where the Soviet people actually overwhelmingly endorsed a reformed Soviet Union, which was to become, I believe it was like the Union of Sovereign Republics or something like that. Without the ideological overtones, but a union of the various national republics. The Union State is looking to replicate that, but on a much smaller scale between Russia and Belarus. This is the flag for it. As a flag enthusiast, not a big fan of it, to be honest. Would have been good if it was like a Marxist state, but my autism, this flag doesn't appeal to me. But with the way things are going with the war, like I say, if Russia does take away some kind of substantial gains from the war, I think that this union will become a certainty at some point where Belarus and Russia will effectively merge. I just lost my train of thought there. Let me go back to this. With that, I think I just touched on that point. So that is the very haphazard and poorly prepped Belarusian segment. Sorry for that, chat. Lukashenko wants Russia to unite with Europe into a single Eurasian state, but also Belarus is likely to, in the medium to long term, to have a political unification with Russia, which has kind of always been on the cards, but I think is now de facto locked in because of events surrounding Ukraine and the geopolitics of the entire region. I can't see Lukashenko trying to, like I say, Russia would have to completely collapse, in my view, which I don't think is a very feasible or a desirable situation for Belarus to not end up in this fate. And either way, if Russia was to somehow collapse, I don't really see how Lukashenko could remain in power. So with that, we'll just go on to a quick run through of what's happened on the ground in Ukraine over the past couple weeks. So, starting off on the north, we'll go actually. There's been various reports, some very interesting reports building up to the expected large offensive. Interestingly, various observers will note that the Russian Air Force has been largely absent or very lacking and lackluster during the entirety of the war. There's been some discussions and rumblings that this might be about to change, where accepting of potential casualties and losses of aircraft will be worth it, but that the Russian Air Force will be forced to go into the fights to provide more direct fire support to Russian forces on the ground. Evidence to support this is that there's been talk that Russian fixed-wing aircraft, that's jets to non-aviation artists, have been building up in large numbers in the various airfields bordering Ukraine, including in Belarus. People remember I shared into the chat every now and again that there is a Russian MiG-31. The MiG-31 is the supersonic fighter that deploys the Kyzal supersonic missile. They have a habit of taking off almost on a daily basis out of air bases around Minsk. They fly down to the Ukrainian border, and I think it's actually very rare they ever fire anything, but the point of that is observers in Minsk pass it back to Ukraine that these aircraft take off, and when that happens, all the air raids across Ukraine go off because the Ukrainians are kind of expecting that they might be firing missiles into Ukraine. The Russians have cottoned on to this, and I think just as part of the harassment that they do out of Belarus, is they just do that to kind of disrupt the runnings and the everyday life in Ukraine by forcing air raid sirens across the country. But also other air bases in Belarus, there's been a marked buildup of Russian Air Force aircraft and personnel, but also in Belgorod, Bryansk, Kursk, Voronezh and Rostov Oblast, there's also been a large buildup of Russian ground attack and fighter aircraft as well that's been reported, largely sourced pardon me, from commercially available satellite companies, the sort of, I believe it's Maxar and other ones that provide daily updates, satellite pictures of the ground. People have been looking at those and have noted that there's been a lot more activity at these air bases surrounding Ukraine. Also in Bryansk, Kursk, and Belgorod Oblasts, it's also been noted that there is now, over the past month, there's been the construction and expansion of staging points and mobilization centers. These were set up before the invasion back last year, in February and January last year. This is where you bring all the troops, all your equipment to get kitted out and to prepare them before they go on a defensive operation. People have marked that those are starting to appear in these three oblasts bordering northern Ukraine, which is sort of suggesting that the Russians, as part of a renewed offensive, might try and make a push into Sumy, Chernigov, and maybe even Kharkov Oblast again. As this map illustrates, and as people will remember, the Russians attempted this in the initial invasion and it failed fairly poorly. So be interesting to see if they fare any better if they do choose to go in again this time across the border into these areas. This kind of would follow what I think is probably the best option for the Russians at this stage if the Russians really are looking for any kind of proper strategic victory. I think the only road open to that is for them to try and take everything east of the Dnieper, to hollow out Ukraine east of the Dnieper, because it's hard for me to envision a scenario where the Russians will ever get west across the Dnieper. They held on to Kherson as long as they could because it was this crucial bridgehead on the western bank. At this stage, I don't see how the Russians are potentially going to ever be able to get back across it at this stage. So people who keep telling me that, it's only a matter of time before Nikolaev and Odessa is once again Russian cities. I did an entire stream on why that was very unlikely last year, while the Russians had this bridgehead on the west. I don't think that is at all feasible at all. So I think the Russian strategic vision at this stage extends to the Dnieper. not to anywhere west of it. I think that's the limits of what the Russians can really hope to achieve at this stage. That's not to say that the Russians might, hypothetically, at some point, might try and use Belarus to try and get a bridgehold to the west of the Dnieper, but we're talking, like, I think that would be at least years away at this stage. So I think Russian ambitions are relegated to everything east of the Dnieper. I think that's for a number of reasons. The Dnieper is a very good strategic defensive position, and also it'd be a lot more easy. It'll be easier for the Russians to potentially control and pacify this territory if they do manage to ever take it, which is a long shot in of itself, going by what Russian military capability has proved to be over the past year. That's not to say, the Russians will take this territory. That's a long shot, and the Russians will really have to upgrade their capability and their competency before that becomes a viable scenario to me. But nonetheless, I think that's what the Russian ambitions now are, to hollow out Ukraine east of the Dnieper, and that's why they're probably potentially looking at building up forces and crossing back across the border to blindside the Ukrainians and to open up new fronts and try and cut off supply lines down to the Donbass. So, with that sort of spiel out of the way, fighting is picked up in Kharkov Oblast. There was a Russian effort towards the town of, if I can pronounce it correctly, Dovreshina. There was reports that the Russians took this town. That was not correct. It is actually this small town here. I'm not too sure why this map hasn't updated it, but from my understanding is this is currently held by the Russian army, and there is conflict somewhere along this line, with the Russians potentially looking to take the actual town was Dovreshina and get this crossing, get this bridge, these bridges and the crossings across what I think this might be the Oskol. I think this is the Oskol River here. But also further to the south, the Russians are also alleged to be looking to try and retake Kupiansk. People will remember whenever the Ukrainian Kharkov offensive happened and the Russian positions just completely collapsed. The Russians very briefly and incompetently tried to form a defensive line around Kupiansk, and then that just completely collapsed in of itself the second the Ukrainians caught up. But that seems to be what the ultimate goal of this small Russian offensive action in Kharkov is for, with the idea of trying to get crossings across the Oskol, but with the idea to eventually potentially take Kupiansk later down the line. Further south on the Kramina and Savatov axis, but mostly around Kramina to Liman, heavy fighting continues in these forested areas as it has for months now, but it seems that the Russians are slowly building up manpower and equipment in this area. The fighting largely seems to be back and forth. The problem with this terrain is there's very few roads and it is very forested, so it's very hard to try and move heavy equipment and large numbers of men through it, and also the supply and logistics to support those men. The main reason is down to the lack of roads. There's very few roads, and the main one is this road, I believe, that goes up to Liman here. Because there's so few roads, both sides tend to have their artillery and spotters very zeroed in on the road, so if anything tries to exploit the road, it gets hit by artillery or fire, which bogs everything down. So largely everything has to move through the forests, which necessitates it has to be moved by hand. And from my understanding, the way the fighting is going is that the Russians will slowly push forward, then they'll be hit by a Ukrainian counterattack that will push them back, and then the Ukrainians will push forward, then they'll be hit by a Russian counterattack that will push them back, and that's kind of how it's gone for months now. Both sides are very heavily entrenched and invested in this forested area. But from what I've been seeing is it seems to be that the Russians are slowly starting to gain a bit of upper hand. Mobilized personnel are starting to feed into the area, bulking up Russian numbers, and also elements of Russian Spetsnaz operators seem to be fairly adept at infiltrating Ukrainian lines and making small gains in the area. So this is an area that I've been keeping a small eye on, but I'm not expecting a massive breakthrough by either side at least this stage. Another thing on the whole Kharkov front, this is one of the areas where the upcoming Ukrainian spring offensive is said to potentially be targeting. So keep an eye on it for that if it ever does come. The other one is obviously Zaporozhye, but I'll go down to that in due course. Moving further south, the breakthrough in Soledar has allowed Wagner at the start, but Wagner is slowly being replaced by regular Russian army units. They're not really advancing as much as they were. They seem to have slowed down their advance, but the Russians are probing Ukrainian lines to the south of Seversk and trying to whittle down Ukrainian strong points that still maintain on the old front line before the breakthrough at Soledar happened. There was some reports that the Russians retook Bilhorovka. Every time I mention Bilhorovka, I point out that if people remember last year, where the Russians tried to cross the river in a fording operation and were destroyed by artillery and lost significant amounts of men and manpower. But then the Ukrainians tried it, and then the Russians tried it again at the same point. That is in this area. But the Russians have not taken Bilhorovka. That was a false report. They come out seemingly every other week. The Russians say they've taken it, but the Ukrainians always post videos of their troops still in the town. This is the only town that the Ukrainians hold that is in Luhansk Oblast. So as long as this town remains in Ukrainian hands, Luhansk Oblast is still technically, I guess, contested as such. There's a couple of small hamlets in these slivers of an area, but Bilhorovka is like the only actual proper settlement at this stage. So moving down to where the big story is happening. It's not reflected on this map. I don't know if it's just because it hasn't been updated or not, but Wagner is reported to have completely secured Krasnohora, and are also pushing into the town of Paraskoivka. But also Wagner is reported to have pushed down to this wooded area, and I think this is like a small industrial area, maybe like a farm area whenever I was looking at it on the satellite map earlier on, which has given them fire control over the rail and roads in this area, which means that Ukrainian forces in Paraskoivka is now effectively encircled. There's estimates that potentially up to 1,500 Ukrainian troops, that's going by what Wagner and the Russians say, are now encircled in this area. This is particularly note because once this effectively completely falls, this opens the door for Wagner and the Russians to properly push into the north of Bakhmut. So that's the reason why there's a lot of chatter about this area at the moment. But going about here, whenever Wagner properly broke through the Ukrainian lines, they kind of broken out into open country and were starting to make good progress, but that seems to have slowed down Ukrainian resistance. But I also think the Wagner unit itself, you have to understand from mine, it's like 15,000 men. And then I'm not too sure if they include the conscripts in that number or not. But it's a fairly, in terms of military size, it's not the largest unit. So I think the reason why Wagner started to slow on the north and the south of Bakhmut was just there was too much terrain to cover, and also the ferocity of Ukrainian resistance kind of slowed them down. So there was some speculation that the Wagner might just start to break out and make a hard push up the main road towards Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. That hasn't come to pass, at least not yet anyway. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Ukrainians have now started to erect new defensive lines around this northern thrust in Bakhmut. In Bakhmut itself, heavy fighting continues in the eastern and the southern suburbs of the city. I'll come to this point. I've touched on it briefly. There's some very interesting things going on with Wagner at the moment. Without going into the weeds of Russian factionalism and pettiness and corruption and all that kind of stuff. The Wagner Group and Prigozhin have come out and said that someone in the Russian MOD is intentionally starving them of ammunition, that they're not sending ammunition supplies to Wagner units operating around Bakhmut. And in some of the more extreme cases, they have alleged that someone is actively sabotaging the ammunition stocks being sent to the frontline units. I've only seen 1/2 reports of it being quote unquote sabotaged. And the report I seen was that the ammunition that they were sent was just, it was old, and it was in such a condition that if they were to fire it, it would probably explode in the rifle, or they didn't specify what type of ammunition, but they said that if they were attempted, the post that I read said that had the Wagner troops tried to use the ammunition that they were given, they genuinely feared that it would probably end up injuring or killing the person operating whatever munitions it was. So there's another example of the never-ending capacity for Russia to hamstring itself. The feud between Prigozhin, Shoigu, Wagner, Kadyrov against the Russian MOD seems to be fully alive and well. Again, Wagner is the only real part of the Russian operation here that has actually achieved something pretty substantial over the past 6 months. Naturally, the Russian MOD seems to be pissed off at this and are trying to hamstring and undermine the success that the Wagner troops are having. Especially whenever you consider just the absolute shit show that's happened around Volhydar, which I'm going to come into in of itself. But yeah, not very good reflections on the Russian MOD at this stage if this actually pans out to be true. The Wagner troops and posts on Wagner telegrams show that they're pretty pissed off, understandably, about this, that they are the ones out there actually taking ground and achieving results. And it's bureaucrats and petty politics back in Moscow that's now seeking to undermine them. Another thing that's happened, which might feed into this, is slowly Wagner's frontline sort of lead on the area around Bakhmut is slowly being withdrawn. It's been noted by the Ukrainians and by certain Russian units that Wagner is less and less are the ones doing the attacking and the pushing around Bakhmut. The VDV elements of the VDV, specifically the again, this is where I should have actually performed a bit of preparation for this stream. But the VDV units that were present during the Kherson offensive on the defense, pardon me, is that it? No. That's not the unit. I forget the unit off the top of my head, but elements of the VDV that were present during the Kherson counteroffensive on the defending side, they've kind of been absent largely from the fight since they were pulled out of Kherson, and there's estimations that they are now starting to push up and replace Wagner in the lead in leading the offensive around Bakhmut at the moment. So there's a number of reasons for that. I think it's one because Wagner have been fighting hard here for over a month now, and it is heavy fighting, and I think they've taken a lot of casualties, not only to the conscripts, but also to the professional Wagner forces as well. I think that it's just come to the time where they need to rotate those Wagner units out to have them refresh, relax, re-equip, and reinforce. Alongside this, as I briefly mentioned up here, this is a substantially larger front now than, if you remember, just whenever Bakhmut was kind of where Wagner's responsibility for the front was. I believe it was around somewhere down here, because this is where the DNR troops start to take over the front line. So the area of the front where Wagner was actually in charge of was fairly small. Then they broke through its Oldar, and then the actual sort of terrain of the front that they have to man has increased largely. Plus, they're also got a lot of men trying to push into Bakhmut itself. So I think Wagner, a lot of Wagner has just kind of exhausted itself, needs to be pulled out and reinforced. But also, I think that now another thing that's probably happening in the background is alongside the shenanigans of trying to strip away the ammunition supply to Wagner. There were some reports that whenever Wagner troops approached regular Russian army units and asked them for ammunitions, is that the regular army units, no regular army unit is just going to pass over its ammunition because, you know, they need it themselves. But is that interestingly, from the report that I read, is that the Russian soldiers, the actual standing Russian army troops, who weren't in the fight, these are the people who are manning the artillery and logistics battalions behind the lines. Whenever Wagner approached them to try and resupply, is that the soldiers themselves said that they would love to, effectively is that they would have, but they are under strict orders from their senior officers not to supply Wagner. So alongside this, I think you've got the Russian standing military, the Russian army, with the Russian MOD is seen sort of an opportunity. Wagner's kind of done the heavy lifting. We are going to try and insert the Russian army here to try and secure the victory of Bakhmut. So I think there's kind of a dual thing going on here. Wagner needs to be pulled out and refreshed and reinforced, but also I think you've got the Russian armies trying to insert the VDV and their own forces to, if it does come, to take over Bakhmut, so that they can try and say, look, the Bakhmut was a Russian victory, it was a Russian army victory, and try and deny Wagner sort of their glory and success here. So I think there's also a bit of politics, petty politics and factionalism in Moscow that's also happening here. So as I was briefly saying, there's heavy fighting in the eastern suburbs and to the south, but there's not really been a lot of change here. The only real story that I've seen is there's been some, I've not actually seen the video of it, but there's been videos going about showing a Kornet missile in flight that is alleged to have killed an American volunteer who is claimed to have been a medic, which I'm pretty dubious of. It was pretty clear he was a combatant, but nonetheless. I believe that was in this sort of area, which is interesting because from my understanding is Wagner is nowhere near that area, so quite how the Kornet missile hit them down there, I'm not entirely sure of, but that's the only real interesting thing I've seen that's come out of Bakhmut itself in the past couple days. But more interesting to me is what's happening in the south. In my last stream, I believe I briefly mentioned it, but whenever Wagner was really starting to push out in the south here, it looked like they were going to push into Chasiv Yar and down into Konstantinivka. They never quite got as far as Konstantinivka, but they got as close as enough where people in the city said that they could hear the small arms of fighting on the outskirts of the city. But since then, Ukrainian counterattacks have slowly been building up in this area, and they've actually pushed Wagner back a couple of miles. So whereas before, I believe the lead elements of Wagner had started to push into this sort of urban area to the south of Chasiv Yar and across the road, they've been pushed back to the other side of the H42 highway. So now, normally the highway is back under Ukrainian control, but you can be sure if anything ever actually does try to drive up that highway, it will be destroyed. But from my understanding is that Ukrainian counterattacks are ongoing in this area, so this is up for debate at the moment. We will have to see if the Ukrainians can further push back the Russian positions here, or if the Russians can try and regain the initiative and repulse the Ukrainian counterattacks in this area. So that's kind of the Bakhmut area done. Further south along all the way down to Donetsk, it's kind of just the usual story. Artillery duels here, small infantry pushes here and there, but nothing really of note that I've picked up on. Same is with Avdiivka and Maryanka. The places are just effectively rubble-strewn wastelands at this stage. The Russians seem fairly keen on putting up drone footage of T-90Ms for some reason, operating in the rubble of this area and firing TOS missiles into this area, but there's been no real change in territory as far as I can see. It just seems that the Russians are using this as gunnery practice for their T-90s at this stage. So with that, we go further down to, which we'll have a bit of a discussion about, Volhodar. I'm not planning on spending too long on this, because I've posted extensively about it in the channel itself. But needless to say, the Russians have not had very good results in this area. Pretty catastrophic, to be honest. Incompetent command, poor battlefield tactical leadership, poor morale amongst the men, just superior Ukrainian observation and artillery and gunnery. Whatever the reason, the Russians have had a very poor showing in this area. And I've posted about it extensively in the Telegram, so I'm not going to rehearse it all here. But the fate of the 155th Naval Infantry Battalion especially is kind of the story of what's happened in the Volhodar area. Just to quickly recap on the 155th. People will remember back before Christmas, there was an interesting fighting over the town of Palivka. There was a bit of a mystery why both sides became so invested in the fight, but they did, and there were significant casualties on both sides. The 155th, just to touch on the 155th, the 155th is a Russian naval battalion that is based in Vladivostok. The Russian naval infantry, alongside the VDV, is largely considered to be like the elite premier fighting units of the Russian military. They're above guards battalions. These are the people who are earmarked to get the best equipment as soon as they can. These are the people who actually go through proper training in their military careers. These are the people who get deployed to places like Syria. This is the unit that is expected to perform. So before the war happened, the officers in the unit couldn't get away with like pilfering the training or the armaments budget. So very good unit, very capable troops, but it's largely been destroyed in Ukraine for a number of reasons. So back whenever they were fighting over Palivka, the 155th was the one that was sent into largely, well, actually before we come into Palivka, the 155th first made its debut in the war in Mariupol. They were part of the regular army that assisted the DNR in the taking of Mariupol. They seem to have equipped themselves fairly well. They were well regarded by the Ukrainians that I seen whenever they spoke about them. And the DNR largely credited them with helping them win the battle in the end. But it was not without cost. They suffered significant casualties, but largely the unit remained cohesive and came out with the battle fairly... I don't want to give percentages on what was lost, but they lost a number of men and equipment in Mariupol. They were pulled back, reorganized, and then later I believe they also made a brief debut somewhere else on the Zaporozhye front, but where they really came to show was in Palivka. Palivka, kind of like Volhodar, was a grinder. Russian and Ukrainian losses were extremely high, but the 155th was absolutely mauled, trying to cross the open ground to get into the town itself. To such an extent, elements of the 155th released videos, wrote letters, and protested being constantly put into the firing line due to the sheer number of casualties they were taking back. I think this was October, November, maybe into December. I think it was round about then. After Palivka eventually fell, the 155th had to be pulled out of the line, reinforced and reconstituted, and then they were pushed back into the same area to try and take Volhodar. And from what I can see from extensive posts that I've put up on Telegram over the past couple of weeks, number if not a month, and going about just generally anywhere on Telegram, the 155th has largely been destroyed. The entire unit is I don't know if it does exist, but it is not an elite unit anymore. The amount of men in vehicle losses that is sustained trying to push across these open grounds. I believe I did it briefly in a previous stream, but I think it is probably worth... Let me just... I'm going to bring up a satellite map just to kind of show the terrain here and why it is just so brutal. And why the 155th has been decimated trying to cross it. So, satellite map. There's Mariupol, so Volhadar is... So where's Volhadar? Here we go. So, to give you an idea of this terrain, I've spoken about it before, but it's worth pointing out again for this here. As you can see, this is the town of Volhadar. You have Soviet-era high-rises here, which give the people, the defenders, the Ukrainian defenders in this town, the road they'll allow us. I think I did this last time, but we never quite. So, not really the best, but as you can see, they're not exactly 1 or 2 story buildings. They do give a bit of vantage point around the town. Why does it do that? Why does it always go back to where I was? Just did this and I've lost my place again. Oh, there's a town called Azov. Where is it? Literally, there we go. So, that the buildings are also amplified by the terrain around the town, which is illustrated quite aptly here, is largely farmland, just open farmland again, as I keep pointing out in pretty much every stream I do about this. The open country, this is Eurasian steppe. The only real terrain features in this area is the river, the water feature along here, but also the mines up here, which have created like hills out of slag and mine deposits, which are really the only hills in the Donbass area. But the 155th and the Russian army largely have been trying to push up along this area here, just to the east of Volhadar, and it has been a complete disaster for them, and have lost significant numbers of men and equipment because, as you can see, the only real cover in this area are these stretches of, like, they're not hedgerows, they're like thin strands of forest, and I believe they're kind of like 10 meters across at best. So anything trying to head up here, and don't forget, it is winter as well. There isn't going to be leaves on these trees, and what trees are there have probably been under constant artillery bombardment in some form or another, so they are not really going to offer any kind of cover as well. And whenever I say cover, I'm not talking about cover from things being shot at it. I'm talking about cover from being seen from these buildings, from Ukrainian drones, from Ukrainian troops entrenched in these sort of like forested hedgerows, because what the Ukrainians have done all around Volhadar is they have heavily mined the fields around it, but they have also zeroed in their anti-tank guided missile systems, which are going to be up in these buildings here, but also most crucially, Ukrainian artillery is zeroed in on pretty much any feature at all surrounding Volhadar. So anytime that the Russians have tried to push up and try and advance along these hedgerows, well, the second they come to Ukrainian troops embedded in trenches in these forests, within minutes, if even that, Ukrainian artillery comes down and hits the Russian troops trying to advance. If they've got vehicles with them, they are being harassed by anti-tank guided missiles fired out of these buildings. This is only like a couple of miles, if even that. So this is well within range of anti-tank guided missile systems. A missile fired from here, so what? That's 100 meters. So what you're talking about, half a mile, a missile fired out of here is going to be onto a target within maybe about 10 seconds or more, 10, 15 seconds. So once that happens, is what we've been seeing is lots of videos and pictures of clusters of Russian tanks, BTRs and BMPs knocked out all next to each other. What happens is they come up, they try and push up to support the infantry pushing up through these trees. Anti-tank guided missiles come out of the trees, hit one of the vehicles, that panics the entire company. then Ukrainian artillery starts to come down. That completely drives it destroys the cohesion of the company. All the vehicles and infantry still alive and operating at that stage just decide, okay, we're bugging out. It's time to save ourselves. And there have been significant numbers of this, where you'll have BMPs, tanks, BTRs that will then try and pull back, and they end up hitting mines. And you have entire companies of Russian tanks and IFVs that are now knocked out all around this area. And the ones that are hit by mines are probably salvageable. There's a lot of videos now of Ukrainian drones dropping grenades into abandoned Russian tanks and BMPs in this area. That's because an anti-tank guided missile is probably going to destroy these stuff, but whenever they hit a mine, the only damage really the mine does is it detracts one of these vehicles, so the vehicle can no longer drive, but other than that, it's perfectly operable. So conceivably they could be recovered, but the Ukrainians are now destroying these vehicles in tandem, so the loss is complete for the Russians. And then Russian infantry, like I say, the only real way that they can advance without taking fire from small arms fire all around this area is to try and push up through these hedgerows, these tree lines. Well, once they come up to contact with a Ukrainian unit will then report back to the artillery, which is already zeroed in. Okay, 10 meters in front of this this grid location, whatever, Russian infantry there. Ukrainian artillery comes down and just peppers the entire area, and the Russian attack is destroyed, and significant casualties are incurred. And the story of the 155th and also supporting the 155th was a Spetsnaz brigade, the 14th Spetsnaz brigade, who lost their colonel in the fighting here. It seems to be whatever senior commander was in charge in this area just kept throwing the men back in the same positions, doing the same thing. I don't know if they've thought that they could replicate what Wagner did up in Bakhmut in Volhydar, with just this constant throw man into the same location and hope for results from it. The reason it worked in Bakhmut was because the men that the Wagner were throwing into it were the conscripts, the penals. These are men who are, no one's going to miss a thief, a rapist, a murderer from a Russian penal colony. They're expendable by nature. They were there as bullet sponge. They were there to bog down Ukrainian troops. And whenever they did find somewhere they could break through, the professional Wagner troops went through. For some reason, whatever idiot seems to have been in charge in this area thought that they would do that with some of the most well-trained and best-equipped Russian units. Very poor use of a very valuable asset, and the 155th, from my understanding, has been completely pulled out of the line because it's just been completely decimated as a result of the fighting here. So I don't think we're probably going to be hearing much from the 155th. And the plight of the 155th became such an issue that Wagner themselves came out and really started to criticize the Russian commander down in this area. I believe he's like a Tuvan or a Burat officer. But the general in charge of this area of the front, Wagner, did a pretty scathing post about him, saying that he was sending these men to die needlessly, which I think is probably very accurate. Pretty grim. There were some reports that there were some Russian units as far as the coal mine. Not quite confirmed one way or the other. There was videos definitely of Russian tanks destroyed up here, but I'm not too sure. I don't think Russian troops are actually up in this area. Had they been able to take this area and properly hold it and reinforce it, that's whenever Volhydar could potentially have started to have fallen. But from my understanding is that the Ukrainians pushed back whatever was happening up in this area. So Volhydar, some reports today saying that there was fighting in the town. Bit skeptical of that. We've had many reports where the Russians claim that they're fighting in the town itself. I don't think that's really happened. I'll wait to see video evidence to prove otherwise. Other than that, the Russians have had a very bad showing in Volhydar, and I don't think that's going to be changing anytime in the near future. elsewhere along the Zaporozhye front, I believe that there was some small gains by the Russians near the town of Orkiv. Or how do you pronounce this? Orkiv? Yeah. I believe that the Russians have launched some probing attacks and made incremental gains around here. But largely that's sort of the change in the front so far. Down on the Kherson area, there's occasional skirmishes and back and forth fighting over these islands in the Dnieper. Ukrainian special forces particularly is fairly active down here. I think it's largely a harassing role to tie down Russian assets down here, but every now and again there's fighting back and forth over one of these islands along here. Both sides are using drones to harass the other side by dropping grenades, RPG shells, and all kinds of stuff. And also the Russians are firing anti-tank guided missiles at various targets that they happen to spot along the Kherson waterfront. And other than that, it's just the usual story of heavy artillery firing back and forth here, there, and everywhere all along the front, as always. So that's kind of the updates on the front as far as I am aware of them. What was the other thing I wanted to discuss? Briefly, we will go to Balloon Watch. The Russians have been using balloons with reflectors. These are just normal, like, weather balloons type things. Balloons tend to have a fairly small radar signature, so if you strap a bit of metal with mirrors onto them, it creates a larger radar signature. 6 of these balloons were shot down over Kiev Oblast. These are extremely cheap to make. It's a balloon with a bit of metal and glass. But the cost to deal with them is extremely painful for Ukraine as such. Ukraine doesn't have endless stocks of anti-aircraft missiles, especially strategic ones, that you would use to shoot down fast-moving aircraft. What I think the Russians are doing now is they've seen what's happened in the United States, and they are now using balloons to whittle down Ukrainian air defense systems and missile stocks having to deal with these balloons. People have said, well, why don't you just ignore the balloon? Well, you don't know if the balloon potentially has something on it, if it's going to be getting intelligence. If you're on a radar guided system, you don't know if that radar signature, I guess you could track it by the speed it moves, but you don't know what it is. Is it a missile? Is it some kind of Russian weapon system? Is it a balloon? Do you take the risk and not fire and save the missile? And then you find out like this was a balloon that was carrying some kind of bomb that dropped and killed a bunch of people. The problem is you have to shoot these things down in one way or the other. And the Russians are playing that off to use the Ukrainians to expand their missile stocks, which I think feeds back to the earlier point I made, where there's rumors that the Russian Air Force is going to become a lot more active in the conflict. So if they can try and wear down Ukrainian air defense before they start sending in their jets and fast movers, that's obviously a bonus for them. And then touching on the balloon issue on a wider scale, the balloons that were shot down recently over the United States, besides the Chinese one off South Carolina, the Pentagon's come out and I believe that they've said that they might have been hobbyist balloons. I'm sure there is some kind of autistic hobby with balloons, but they say that they didn't really anticipate them to actually have come from a foreign power, or there was some kind of actual commercial or hobbyist balloon. So that's an interesting thing to consider there. But the other aspect of what I think they might have been, and what I wouldn't be surprised for the Russians and the Chinese to do now is, I mean, if I was the Russians, or if I was even the Chinese, but particularly the Russians, I mean, I think this would be very good for the Russians to do on the cheap, is just release these balloons, just every now and again, just release like 12 balloons out of like eastern Siberia, let them float over the United States and just cause the panic. I think that's kind of like an indirect way for the Russians to try and strike back as such and whittle down the Americans. for American support to Ukraine. Release very cheap balloons that are going to be seen by people in the United States, by the public. There's going to worry the public. It's going to cause drama within politics in the United States that is going to have to, by nature, elicit a military response to shoot them down. You know, the hundreds of thousands, the millions of dollars that go in to fly the aircraft, to fire the missile, to do the recovery operation. To me, this seems like a very good economic warfare option for the Russians and potentially the Chinese to wage against the United States. Just fire balloons. Just deploy them en masse over the United States. And one, that's going to put strain on American missile stocks. If the Americans are having to keep back various missiles, well, I guess if they're putting them on jets, they aren't exactly sending jet air-to-air missiles to Ukraine, but nonetheless, it will put a bit of strain on the American military having to deal with these balloon incursions. The Americans are going to have to shoot down the balloons, because if they don't, well, how do they know there isn't like another Chinese balloon that's listening to classified military chatter in California or whatever? That's it. So that to me is just like a harassment thing I think the Russians could very well and very affordably do to kind of strike back at the United States. But also in Ukraine, it provides a very real and tangible military benefit. Just mass deployment of balloons force the Ukrainians to shoot them down and wear down their missile stocks. And whenever the point comes that they'll free up Russian Air Force to operate with a bit more leeway. So that's kind of the point on balloons. What was the other thing I wanted to quickly touch on? There's a lot more videos coming out. They're coming thick and fast now of Ukrainians being forcibly pulled into recruitment offices. I think it is showing. I don't think this is Ukraine struggling to find manpower the way people are saying it. There's a lot of people who are posting these videos and saying, well, this proves that the Ukrainian army is running out of men, so therefore the Ukraine is going to collapse. No, I don't think that's what it is. I do think Ukraine is starting to hurt for manpower. Not necessarily on the front line, but in terms of the people who are being fed into the training behind the lines. Ukraine is a country of 40 million people. You can guess around about 20 million, 19 million of that is going to be men, of which, like, what's the Ukrainian population pyramid? I would say at least you've got about 7 million men who are able to fight. So with that, I think we're probably talking somewhere between 150,000 to 200,000 Ukrainians have been killed or injured to such a state where they are combat ineffective. Probably similar figures on the Russian side. I know it's kind of just plucked out of the air, but 200,000 men taken out of 7 million, that still leaves like 6,800,000 men. I don't think the Ukrainians are necessarily hurting to put people in the line and hold the gun, but what I think it is that in order to fill up the roles, is that the Ukrainians are starting to properly tighten the screws on people who should be brought into service, but have been avoiding it. I do think that this is to make up potential shortfalls in certain areas of Ukraine, be it in the border patrol area, be it just to make up the training battalions, whatever it may be. But I think this is part of the wider political and machinations that are going on in Ukraine at the moment. The large corruption purge, quote-unquote purge, that Zelensky has done that only seems to target people who are not a member of his party. I think this is kind of the Ukrainian state trying to re-establish control over elements of Ukrainian over the elements of the Ukrainian population, of forcing people who are obligated to fulfill their obligations as such. Waiting to be proved wrong on this. We'll have to wait and see. But that's just kind of my little nuance on what I think these videos are. The Ukrainian recruiters and the people going out and grabbing these men do seem pretty aggressive in their actions. But I don't think it is as what some people are suggesting, that you have a bunch of Ukrainian enlistment personnel just walk down the street, find a young man, and grab him and pull him into a bus. I don't think that's happening. I think it is they're tracking down people who have gotten summons to appear for service and have been avoiding that service. These men are going out and finding those people and dragging them into service. That's my nuance on what I think is happening there. So, no, come on, that. With that, what else was there? Anything else? Probably a couple other things I was meaning to discuss, but me doing no preparation at all, I can't really recall off the top of my head. So let's have a look what chat's saying. What is chat saying? If anyone wants to ask anything, go ahead. So SD guy 3030 for $2 US. Thank you so much. Have some shackles. Thank you. Oh, this is the point where my throat's a bit sore already, so I don't know if I can do the voice, but please, you have to come and help Bohanka chat. The people is me, President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, here to ask for a generous donation to help keep us in the fight. For Bohanka chat to remain operating and to review everything that happens in this war till a common victory comes about. I am asking you now to consider maybe donating a little bit to help us in our common struggle. I wasn't as good as my previous accent, but I know some people liked my Zelensky accent. So, and it hurts my throat. Bunker housing for 50 Swedish crowns. Here's some money I managed to hold away from the Swedish Socialist Occupation Government. Are you going to talk about how they bully Wagner? I addressed that through the video, so if you have any other questions relating to that, I will try my best to do that. Now would be a good time to insert ads. The more viewers are watching, the more money create. Chat, did I just insert an ad? I got a pop up. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Did I actually just shackle shab an ab? Chat, tell me, did I just hit you with an ad? What is this pop up I just pressed? Did I just? Did I actually just shackle shab an ab? I don't know. I got a pop-up telling me to insert an ad and I clicked on it, so I don't know if I did that or not. Sorry. I didn't. I don't want to bombard you with ads. Right, where was I? Metaphysical Mike for $1.11. Thank you so much. With no comment. The die is cast between traditionalist in the East and corporate culture of the West. Yawn, can we go on to serious? Okay, well, thank you for the encouragement there. The offensive started the day after the 84th anniversary of Stalingrad Russian operational temp. I mean, I don't think this is the offensive. If it is the offensive, you know, it's not really the best showing for the Russians. I mean, it would be totally in line with just how incompetent and lackluster the Russians have been throughout the war. But I mean, I'm very skeptical of the idea that this is the offensive. I don't think this is 300,000 men and 6 months of preparation being thrown into it. So I'm reserving comment. What I think it is yeah, I think this is the build up to the offensive, the proper full scale offensive. I think this is the Russians starting to prep the battlefield, maybe try and pull off Ukrainian assets elsewhere in the front, and slowly build up momentum. But I don't think this is like the full-scale Russian offensive. I still think that is still to come. And 17th now. It'll probably come somewhere around the 24th. That's what Sergei Lavrov and elements within the Russian political establishment keep insinuating. So we'll have to wait and see there. I believe that Paraskoriivka has already been liberated. Let's have a look. What's this in French? European and NATO leaders, can they be classified as Ukrainian soldiers? And that's from the 12th. What's the latest? That's not. I mean, there's elements of Wagner within Paraskoriivka, but I know I posted it earlier in Telegram group, but I don't think the village, the settlement, is completely under their control. I believe that there's still Ukrainian elements within parts of the town that is not fully under their control. Whenever the Wagner really starts to push onto the town of well, not the town, but the Barkivka, just to the south of it, but not on the main road, I think that's whenever we can properly say that they've cleared that town. But that's my understanding of it, at least at this moment. Hold on a second, there's a weird noise coming from. Sorry for that, chat. Strange noise coming from one of the other rooms. It's obvious the Russian army is trying to save face. I think it's more the MOD. I think it's the political establishment in Moscow that's detached from the war itself that's playing these political games. I don't think that it's the actual troops and commanders on the ground. Have you all heard reports that Russia is building up troops in their enclave, Kaliningrad? I mean, I've heard reports of that for the past year or so, but I don't think it's really anything too much of note. I don't think the Russians are going to launch an offensive on Poland from Kaliningrad. I think it's just sort of send some troops there is kind of like a gesture to show that they will defend the territory and yada yada yada. Also, I know that they've sent some of their nuclear troops there as well. And what are the chances Russia tries to escalate with NATO? None. Going by their presence in Ukraine, I don't think that Russia is really capable of escalating anything with NATO. I mean, depending on what you say escalating is, but yeah, if you're talking about is Russia going to go to war with NATO? No, at least not by Russia's choosing. Couldn't the Russians bomb a Shelly area? They think they are mines. You would think so. The thing that kind of gets me is that the Russians do have a mine detonating cord thing. What is it? There's a Soviet era vehicle that fires the UR-77 meteorite. You have a video of it in action. There's been videos of them using this thing as an offensive capacity where they fire the charge at Ukrainian strong points, but it is designed mostly to clear minefields. Yeah, here you go. This is pretty good footage that I can use to show you here. So the Russians do have this thing, and it is used in Ukraine. So that's it. It's a rocket fire charge that trails an explosive line, which explodes and is meant to destroy all the mines in a territory. But here they're using it as an actual offensive weapon. So, more footage of it. So they do have this, but I don't know why specifically they haven't used it down in Vuhledar. I don't know if they fear it might be hit by Ukrainian anti-tank guided munitions or something, or because it does seem to be fairly effective at what it does from what I've seen, and the Russians have used it in mine clearing operations here and there. So why they haven't used it in Vuhledar, who knows? But also there is also the added fact that every time the Russians get pushed back at night, Ukrainian troops crawl out of the trenches and relay mines as well. Can't you use satellites to locate mines? Well, if they're buried underground, it's not really. Also, you would have to have a very, very good satellite with very good optics to pick up something like a mine, even if it's not buried under the dirt. So how does one take a position like Vuhledar? I mean, well, this is where we get into kind of like my armchair officer kind of thing. I don't know. I maybe don't. Maybe a better thing would to have kept troops along here so the Ukrainians don't push back, but instead used 155th maybe up along here where there's a lot more cover, and try and push up along this river, whatever this is, like this river valley here alongst these fortifications. So you cut off Vuhledar from the north and weaken the position, and then maybe the Ukrainians would pull out of the town itself. That's if you could take this territory to begin with. Just completely level the town with artillery. One thing that I've kind of wondering is, do both sides not have smoke shells? Like if the big problem is just getting the men across the fields, could you not just line up banks of artillery, give them smoke shells, either just completely envelop the town in smoke so anyone in the town can't see what they're firing at, or just pepper the entire surrounding fields in smoke so troops advancing across it can get into close combat in the town. It is a very unenviable position to take. Just you know, it is a high point around open fields. I'm not too sure if there really is an easy way to take this town with what the Russians have at this stage. But I mean, at this stage, I think the Russians should just kind of cut their losses and maybe redeploy their assets elsewhere. Maybe would they have more luck trying to push further to the west, try and push to the east, and try and cut it off from the north and undermine the position that way? Maybe another angle would be to concentrate Russian drones in this area and zero in stuff to their artillery. So you have drones constantly watching for Ukrainian resupply along the roads into Vuhledar, and they can just try and starve the town out that way. Because so far what they've been trying is just not working, and not working in a very bad way. You know, there are points where it's the enemy is just so entrenched in such an advantageous position that there is no good real way to dislodge them or to try and take the position yourself. That maybe it is just to stay. The only real option is to try and go around it. Where was I? Pardon me. It's not expensive for Ukraine, it's expensive for the American taxpayer. Yeah, but what I mean whenever I'm talking about that kind of stuff is Ukraine only has so many of these systems. They only have so many anti-air batteries. You know, they only have so many Patriot S-300s, yada yada missile systems. If they're shooting them to hit balloons, it's a pretty expensive cost in terms of the stocks they have, not in the dollar value to someone else. Do you think the offensive won't be a complete disaster? Wow. Never underestimate the capacity for the Russians to completely screw something up, but look, if the Russians raise 300,000 men, there's some estimates saying that the Russians have potentially up to 1 million men along the front at this stage. If the Russians, after the past year of war, haven't learned any decent lessons, and if they can't use the new manpower advantage to achieve something pretty decent and substantial, you know, like, then it's at what stage will they? Can they? I'm waiting to see before I can sort of estimate. Like, I'm kind of expecting the Russians to actually achieve something with this. If it completely falls flat in their face, I mean, it's yikes, buddy. Do you think Poland could invade Belarus? Could. Well, I mean, anyone could invade anyone, but I don't think they will. That's just one of these weird, like, the Poles have ran down their tank stocks, lots of their munition stocks to support Ukraine. This idea that Poland is just going to arbitrarily invade Belarus, or the Poles are just waiting for the opportunity to just randomly annex Western Ukraine. Like, guys, it's not very feasible. Like, this is a European Union, and it's a NATO power, and it's beholden to the United States. The Poles aren't just going to randomly drive out and annex Western Belarus or Western Ukraine. Like, no. Like, you don't support these guys fighting for their national sovereignty, and then you're like, hey, we're just going to annex part of your country. Oops, my bad. Oh, look, we've got millions of angry, pissed off Ukrainians now in Poland, on top of all the refugees we've just kind of backstabbed, or, you know, the same in Belarus. Like, it's like, and the arguments don't really line up. Poland once held this territory. Okay, so, I mean, Germany once held this territory. There's really no Germans living here, and there's no real Poles living here. And also, like, can you imagine, like, Ukraine is fighting against Russia, you know, the darling of the Western world, and then the Poles just decide, okay, we're going to come in, and, like, it's not a feasible proposition. And Belarus, I mean, like, why? Both sides have gone out of their way to try and, like, avoid any direct confrontation. Why would the Poles invade Belarus? Like, there's no real good reason. The Polish army isn't ready for it. And also, if the Poles do, well, that's the Collective Security Treaty Organization activated now. That's where you get the Russians in Belarus are now having to fight the Poles, and then that will now mean that you now have a NATO conflict, and it's not a feasible proposition. Like, guys, sorry. Do you think the West is running out of steam and Russia is just warming up? No. No. West is not running out of steam. No, please do the Zelensky accent again. I can't. My throat is sore. Sorry. I apologize, but I can't. Yeah. Or comment, Victor. I apologize, but my throat is really sore due to the strains of war in propping up Ukraine. I just can't. My throat is buggered. I can't. It takes a lot of my throat. And I'm not even doing the accent properly. William Wallace for the 2 separate donations of 99 pence. Thank you very much. By the way, Michael, you do a good job. Thank you very much. I enjoy your streams and find them informative as a fellow artist. Thank you. That's why I do them. The obvious strategy to me would be push up the east bank of the Dnieper River. Wouldn't that collapse the whole front bypass strong points? I mean, that's why I did my hypothetical Zaporozhye stream. I'm not going to repeat the entire stream here, but you know, Zaporozhye to me, if you can invest that, would be a very good way to wear down Ukrainian manpower and assets. And if you do very well, you can push further up the river and then undermine Ukrainian defenses from the west. But to me, like, the biggest thing for me would be, if I was the Russians, I would really start trying to collapse these bridges across the Dnieper. It's kind of curious to me why the Russians really haven't done anything to it. Like, they used a water drone, one of these drones that the Americans and Ukrainians have been using to hit the Black Sea Fleet. They used one of those to hit this bridge here. But I mean, yeah, it's kind of going to slowly disrupt a bit of NATO resupply in this part. But I mean, you've still got all this part which is feeding in supply into Ukraine. This bridge I don't think is as strategic. Like, it was a lot more useful back whenever the Russians were potentially threatening Nikolaev, but I don't see why you really want to go after this bridge. The bridges you'd want to go after, to me, would be the ones around Dnipro and Zaporozhye, and preferably, if you could, further up the Dnieper. Like, you want to isolate eastern Ukraine, east of the Dnieper. So I understand, like, the Antonovsky Bridge has shown that, you know, Soviet-made bridges are pretty sturdy, but at the same time, the things that were hitting the Antonovsky Bridge were HIMARS rockets, which are very accurate and do a lot of damage whenever they're very accurate, but the actual warhead capacity of them is not that much. Like, I would imagine that some of these bridges along the Dnieper, if the Kizil missile, if the Russians are ever going to properly use that thing, if there's one thing that's going to be like a bridge buster, I would imagine it would be a supersonic warhead. And if it's as accurate as the Russians claim to be, like, you're not short of targets across the Dnieper. And if there's a place to really hurt Ukraine, I would say it would be trying to hit these bridges. If even you took down like a couple of the bridges, say around Zaporozhye, well, that moves all the logistics that are going through that. It now has to be pushed north onto these bridges, which puts more strain and puts more distance it has to travel to get to the front. And then if the Russians ended up ever destroying those bridges, well, that pushes all that strain and effort further north. So why the Russians aren't making that concerted effort, who knows? The Shahid missiles, you know, in the same way that the Ukrainians hit the Antonovsky Bridge day in, day after, maybe, you know, if the Russians are saving their Kizils for some unknown purpose, or if they're not as good and or as accurate as they say, well, if the Russians have these hundreds of Shahids, maybe, you know, just return to sender what the Ukrainians did on the Antonovsky Bridge, just mark out a couple of bridges around Zaporozhye and just constantly plug Shahids at it. Pardon me. You know, that's kind of where I think if the Russians are really going to, like, hurt the Ukrainian logistics sub-train, that's the place to do it. And why we're not quite hitting it at this stage, I'm not too sure. Bunker housing for another 50 Swedish crowns. To take full Hadar, you send in Troon squad. No, yeah. Yeah, I don't think the Russians have many Troons. Poland could liberate Kiev, no. Doubt it. Dude, Russia paid for the infrastructure within Ukraine. Why would they destroy it? I mean, technically the Soviet Union did, but I mean, if the Russians went by that argument, they wouldn't have leveled Mariupol and rebuilt it. So, I'm not too sure that argument, like, it's a war. I mean, the slow slugfest through the Donbass has just completely destroyed all infrastructure and all villages within the area, which is going to have to be rebuilt. So I don't really think it's that feasible. If you're going to make an omelet, crack a few eggs, and if you're going to crack a few eggs, the biggest eggs I can see are to take out these bridges, leave an escape route. But who's escaping? The Ukrainian army, because the Ukrainian army is equipping itself quite well. It's standing and fighting, and it shows no sign of imploding. For it to get there, like, you have to starve it of men, equipment, and logistics capacity. And I don't think the Ukrainians are really going to just completely rout. I don't think like the Russians are saving the bridges to allow the Ukrainians to escape. Because I don't think that's a feasible proposition, because just look at this. This is strategic depth here. This is a lot of territory. Like, it just makes sense to me to hit these bridges, and if you can properly take them out of action, then that's whenever the Ukrainian army in the Donbass and everything east of the Dnieper is really going to start hurting. Because you're going to have a lot of people here who are going to need to be fed alongside the military troops who are going to need fuel and ammunition and spare parts. Well, how are you going to supply it then? You're going to have to set up ferries, like what the Russians did in Kherson. They set up that ferry system, and it managed to sustain the Russians only for so long. Granted, it was under constant artillery fire itself, but I mean, like, just think of the basic logistics of this. You've got, like, a truck can cross a bridge in a matter of minutes, whereas if you have to set up like a ferry system, you're talking potentially an hour at least to get the truck on, to get the ferry across the river, to get the truck off, and to send the ferry back. Like, it would just slow everything down, and it would really start to hurt the Ukrainians east of the Dnieper. And then I think that's whenever I think you start to see some serious wear on Ukraine in the Russians' advantage. That's whenever the resupply, the reinforcement of Ukrainian units that are being whittled down in the fighting in the Donbass is going to become a lot harder to replace, and it'll take a lot of time to replace. And then I think that's whenever the Russians really start to get the initiative back. And then I think that's whenever heads in Kiev start to reevaluate certain things, shall we say. So, yeah, that's kind of my strategy, is the Russians need to take out the bridges. But, God, such cope. I love that people always say there's cope, but they never explain what's being coped or how it's not a cope. Do you see any case that would cause Russia to give up and withdraw, or are they in too deep to give up? I think the Russians are in too deep to give up. Ukrainians always seem to surprise, but I can't really see the Ukrainians retaking all this territory. The Donbass, for obvious reasons, very hostile population. I honestly think if the Ukrainians ever somehow got to the stage where they were seriously investing Crimea, I think that is whenever the Russians would probably start moving to extreme options, to be honest. I'm hinting at the nuclear option then. If the Ukrainian army is pushing into Crimea, I think that's whenever the Russians might start deploying tactical nuclear weapons, because that is that is existential for the Russians at this stage. I think the Russians are just kind of in this to the end, alongside the Ukrainians. I think both have been caught in each other's trap as such. Where, what's this? Oh, hot news! There's now air raid sirens all across Ukraine. Another night of drone strikes, it looks like. Yeah. I just, like, I can see a scenario where the fighting bogs down to such an extent along this, where the lines sort of are now. There's some kind of provisional ceasefire that's made where there isn't a peace, but it's not quite a war. It's kind of like what the Donbass was from 2016 up until 20 2022, where both are kind of at a stalemate with each other, and there's sort of like an uneasy peace that kind of comes. One can't dislodge the other, and there's a stalemate, kind of like the Korean situation, which is what Aristovich and a NATO official kind of suggested. I can see that scenario, but I can't see a scenario where the Russians take all of Ukraine and the Ukrainians retake all of the 4 oblasts and Crimea. It's just, I can't really see that very... It's hard for me to see, but just because I see it doesn't mean it can happen. But, like if the Russians did somehow properly lose this war, I honestly think that's the internal stability of Russia. I think it will be seriously threatened at that stage. I'm not saying Russia will collapse, but I think this is where Vladimir Putin and the institutions that he presides over will become so discredited that internal stability in Russia just starts to unravel. I think that's whenever you start to see potentially places in the Caucasus might start to get a bit heated. It's where you might get people like Kadyrov might start to get ideas beyond themselves, because at that stage, that's the Russian military has been proven completely discredited. The political system has invested itself in a disastrous military campaign that is failed. This is in the scenario which I don't think is going to come to pass, but if it did come to pass, so I can't see the Russians ever allowing it to get that stage. So that's just my 2 cents. But I'm waiting to see. I think we'll have a better idea of where the war will go by, say, June, whenever the spring offensive season has largely come to an end or is ongoing. That's kind of where I'm at this moment. Whole year with all of NATO and the Russians are advancing, so that has to got them in there. Disagree. So do you see a case where that Russia would push the red button if only? If there's ever a time where if the Russians aren't going to do it here when they're losing Crimea, like when are they? That's kind of where I'm at. This is why I think the Americans are trying to restrain Ukrainian ambitions around Crimea. Because this is just the Crimea is existential for Russia. Zaporozhye, Kherson, yeah, the Russians make claim to it, but I'm not too sure how to word this, but like this is recent. These aren't integrated. Like people in Moscow aren't feeling like Zaporozhye is as part of Russia as, say, like Rostov is, or potentially even the Donbass. They might feel for them, but they're not looking at Donetsk and saying, oh well, if the Ukrainians take Donetsk, that's basically the same as if the Ukrainians took Bryansk or somewhere. You know what I mean? Is like the investment to me, emotionally, politically, I don't think is as high here. Whereas Crimea is it's been integrated for a while. There's a lot of investment there. A lot of Russians have been there. They go on holiday there. They might even have family there. Not to say that they wouldn't have family or have been to Ukraine at some point, but Ukraine's a bit different from Crimea these days. There's the historical ties to Crimea. There's also whatever you can say about these territories. There is a distinct majority Russian population here that is majority Russian ethnically. So, and also there's just the strategics, like the Sea of Azov is dependent on control of Crimea. With control of Crimea, the Russians can always potentially invest and keep an eye on a future hypothetical rump state Ukraine that still has access to Odessa and the Black Sea. It just projects Russian power into the Black Sea, and the Black Sea has always been an essential element of Russian foreign policy. So, yeah, I mean, like, short of the Ukrainian army deciding, okay, we're going to invade Belgorod or we're going to invade Kursk Oblast, Like, I mean, if there's a time where if the Russian military has been so badly defeated that the Ukrainians are now pushing into Crimea, like the only option then I can really see is like, okay, it's time to roll out the red button. So, and if they did, like a nuclear weapon in of itself, yeah, it would almost like Russia would become the pariah state. That's whenever I think you'll see the Chinese even start to turn on the Russians. But at that same time, it will send a message to the Ukrainians where it's like, okay, this has gone too far. Now is the time for us to seriously speak to each other. Because if you try and take Crimea, we are going to start going to extreme measures. So, how important is Putin to the stability of Russia? At this stage, I think he's largely essential. Everyone in all the political figures in Russia gain legitimacy from Putin. I think he is on his way out. I think we're probably approaching the end of his tenure. I think he's looking to step down at some stage once the war is over. But I mean, if you notice all the factionalism, all the infighting that happens in Moscow, it's all below Putin. And it's all of them trying to gain legitimacy from an association with Putin. Why is Prigozhin constantly doing all these photo ops, flying in MiGs over Ukraine, going to the battlefront? It's because he's trying to build up his profile domestically in Russia to become a popular figure in Russia, so that Putin kind of feels compelled to give him what I would imagine is a fairly high-ranking government job. And why is that? Because whereas like Shoigu, why is this fighting between Shoigu and Wagner and Kadyrov? Well, the Russian regular army is fallen far under par. And why is that? Well, because, without rehashing it all, the man in charge of that is Shoigu. So if the Russian army is completely fallen under par throughout this entire war, well, the person ultimately in charge of it is going to come out looking bad for it. So if he's looking bad, he loses his political capital. He loses the standing he has with Vladimir Putin. So that's where you get people like Prigozhin and Kadyrov start to criticize elements of the Russian army and the Russian military and start jockeying for position. Like, all legitimacy in Russia ultimately comes from Putin at this stage. So, I think the presidency is of such a powerful position in Russia, but also there is the personalized aspect of Putin that helps put this legitimizing aspect down onto the lower institutions of state. So all this infighting is to, like, all the infighting that happens around the war, it's people, I think, is largely down to people trying to gain the confidence of Vladimir Putin and jockeying for positions within his inner circle. So if Putin was somehow removed, I'm not going to say that's the entire Russian state completely destabilized. It depends who takes over and replaces him his role as president. But as it stands, like, all political power comes, like, in the same way in, like, the British state. Technically, all political power and legal legitimacy comes from the crown. Like, obviously it's more of an executive power. All that political power and legitimacy comes from sort of like the presidency, as instituted by Vladimir Putin. So, in his special operations speech of Putin, he said he'd respect Ukrainian territory. Yeah, well, he made that speech with an expectation that a certain plan was going to go to plan, but it didn't. Like, the reason why the annexations happened, I mean, there was going to be votes. The Russians, like, back in March, late March into April, the Russians were floating ideas of holding various, like, referenda in this area. But the reason why it happened at this time was because the Russians were on a back foot, and they were scrambling in the fallout of the Kharkov offensive. But I mean, there was always, as soon as the original plan broke down, I think there was almost always going to be, like, Russian ambitions were going to grow in southern Ukraine. Chat's just arguing about the Euromaidan. So this went on longer than I was expecting it to be. But is there any final points? Anything anyone wants to throw up before I start to wind it down? Yahoo, why does it keep defaulting to Yahoo? Also, if you aren't already, I need to shill this more. Come follow me on Twitter. Build up my social media clout, please. Come follow me. So, why is that on the separate browser? So, continue on narrator from the next 8 years. Okay, well, how effective will be the Russian Air Force if deployed in full force during the coming offensive? No idea. Honestly, I have no idea. On paper, it should be very good, but it depends on how effective Ukrainian air defense is and just how incompetent Russian officers, Air Force officers can be. And if there's one thing I've learned is never underestimate the ability for Russian incompetence. If they perform well, it could be a game changer. If they perform badly, well, they'll perform badly. And I think it was kind of the underperformance of the Russian Air Force in the opening days of the war. It kind of helped Russia get into the state it is in. So, yeah. What would be the geopolitical situation if Ukraine was discovered to have a nuclear program? Honestly, don't know. I don't. Probably not a very good one. I don't know. I'd have to look into that a bit more. I don't think they could really afford one. I know they're talking about trying to restart one, and they probably could get a nuclear weapon if they wanted to. But in terms of the sheer resource and financial cost that would entail, I don't think that is. I don't think Ukraine could really afford just starting up a Manhattan project out of the blue, to be honest. So, yeah. With that, I'm probably gonna sign it off here, chat. So, thank you for coming. When the Russian offensive, if it does ever actually happen, I will be doing streams on that as it happens, so keep an eye out for those. Thank you for coming. This went a bit longer than I expected and my throat is sore. But yeah, hope you guys got something out of this, and I will see you all soon. So speak to you guys in a... No, wait, I need to prepare this. Okay. Radio, speak to you guys soon, and hope you all have a good weekend. See ya. Oh, I just realized I didn't even put on the bloody audio for the music. Bugger.
ночью, не помню где, в городе чужом, прям на улице. Хорошо не спел, не слышал моих песен и не видел никогда моего лица. Я хочу забыть, как мне было чудесно, не могу по кругом голова. Только знаешь, мне совсем не интересно, слава богу, ты не он, а ты она. Еби меня по-китайски, соси мой хуй по-турецки, как будто я самый первый, как будто я твой надменный.